Starship flew on its 8th test flight, and while the booster was caught again, the ship also exploded again. So what happened? How could it be that after everything SpaceX learned on Flight 7, Starship failed again in what seems to be a similar, or maybe even exactly the same way? Did they not learn anything? Is it all doom and gloom, or is there a glimpse of hope that Flight 9 will go a lot better? Hi Star People, I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update, sponsored by Novium. Regardless of whether you're an experienced tank watcher or someone that has no idea about the Starship program, you might agree with me that we need to think about this flight in the context of the previous one, Starship Flight 7. Flight 7 launched on January 16th, and it was the first flight of a new variant of the ship, which often goes by either Block 2 or Version 2. This Block 2 ship is a total redesign of the Starship upper stage as we know it. For example, the ship has been stretched by one ring, which means it's about 1.8 meters taller. This, combined with a shortened payload bay section and flatter elliptical common and forward domes, has increased the available tank volume, allowing the ship to carry an extra 300 tons of propellant and therefore increasing its payload to orbit capability. While the payload bay section was shortened, the new and optimized nose cone space allowed SpaceX to simply use more of that volume to put the newly designed PEZ dispenser that deploys Starlink satellites. This was, in fact, one of the tests that was planned on Flight 7, as SpaceX loaded 10 Starlink simulators inside of Ship 33's payload bay section to test this new dispenser system. The heat shield had also been redesigned, with more resistant tiles, and in addition to that, Ship 33 carried a whole slew of tests on its heat shield, with missing tiles, new materials being tested, and even one actively cooled tile as well. On Flight 7, SpaceX also fitted several pieces of hardware relating to the future catch of ships, installing non-structural versions of the catch pins and also protective ramps on the side of the vehicle. SpaceX was hoping to test this hardware through a re-entry on that flight to confirm that it would work well when it came time to actually catch a ship on a future mission. One of the major changes that doomed Flight 7, though, came in the form of the transfer tubes. You see, the methane tank of the ship is on top of the liquid oxygen tank, which means there needs to be a way for the methane to flow down to the engines. Some rockets have a transfer tube for this on the outside, like SLS or Atlas V, but others have that tube internal to the rocket and it just goes through the bottom tank. Falcon 9 and Starship are that kind of rocket. On the Block 1 ship, this methane transfer tube goes down through the oxygen tank to the aft dome. There, thanks to a set of manifolds, the methane flows through different lines, leading up to the sea level and vacuum-optimized engines. But for Block 2, SpaceX decided to change this fuel distribution system entirely. The ship would still have the central transfer tube to feed methane to the Raptor engines, but only the center ones. Now, each of the Raptor vacuum engines would get their own individual transfer tubes instead of feeding from that central one. This arrangement is actually reminiscent of the Saturn V first stage, which also had a dedicated liquid oxygen transfer tube for each of its 5 F1 engines. The design of these transfer tubes was also improved on Block 2, as they are now vacuum jacketed, meaning they see less exchange of heat and therefore a lower boil-off rate, something that's crucial for future flights of longer duration. But this new system failed on Flight 7. Nearly 8 minutes into flight, the ship started losing engines, which was followed by a loss of attitude control, and eventually the vehicle was lost. All of those new upgrades, all of the testing, all of the future-proofing hardware, all of the experiments went out the window with that loss. SpaceX got to work on finding the root cause and fixing the issue on that launch. After more than a month, SpaceX released an update stating that the most probable root cause of the failure was an increased harmonic response several times stronger than what they had seen during ground testing. This, in turn, broke hardware in the propulsion system, including the fuel feed lines that were just talked about. This caused leaks, the leaks turned into fires on the engine section, and the ship just couldn't handle that, and it was lost. SpaceX also said that they had tested new hardware configurations on these feed lines during the 60-second static fire test of the Flight 8 ship, Ship 34. From the data gathered on that test, they implemented hardware changes to the feed lines, adjusted propellant temperatures, and modified the thrust target for the engines on Flight 8. Since Flight 7 was not able to test much of the new things being implemented on the ship, SpaceX decided to repeat the same plan for Flight 8. So Ship 34 was fitted with the same hardware and had the same planned flight profile, launch out to the east on a suborbital flight, head over to the Indian Ocean, and re-enter there. For Flight 8, the ship would carry only 4 Starlink dummy satellites instead of the 10, but these 4 are all that's needed to test the PEZ dispenser. The first pair of satellites would test the ejection system, and in order to deploy the other pair of satellites, the PEZ dispenser would also have to use the system that lowers the stack of satellites down to the door. These 2 movements are all the things that the PEZ dispenser does, so with only 4 Starlinks, they can already test everything that it needs to do. Another test that SpaceX never got to do on Flight 7 was a relight of one of the Raptor engines on the ship while in space, and so that was also part of the plan for Flight 8. Now, if you're wondering why we're not even mentioning the booster, that's because it worked as intended on Flight 7. Booster 14 did its ascent burn and separated from the ship, and then returned back to the launch site for a catch on the launch tower arms, the second time this was ever achieved. Thanks to this video's sponsor, Novium. They make hover pens, which, as you might guess, are magnetically hovering pens, which are super cool. Dan, come over here.
Hey Jack, how you doing?
This is my dad, Dan. What do you think of the hover pens?
They're great.
Would you like a hover pen?
I'd love one.
Should I give you one of the hover pens that Novium sent me for this ad? Well, I'm not gonna. The Interstellar Edition has a tilt of 23.5 degrees, reminiscent of the Earth's axis of rotation. It comes in super cool colors like Neptune Blue, Starlight Silver, and Mars Magma. Plus, there is a premium version with 18-karat gold and even a real meteorite embedded in the pen. How cool is that? I personally really like the look of the Future Edition, which features an interchangeable tip so you can have a rollerball or a fountain tip and easily switch back and forth as desired. What's not to like? Hover pens are not only high-end pens that provide an excellent writing experience, but they just look so dang cool. So, use code NSF to receive 20% off all hover pens for the next 48 hours. After that, it'll be 10% off. Free international shipping for most countries, including North America, Europe, the UK, Australia, and more. Link in the description below. Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring this video. Alright, the whole reason it was so important to put in perspective everything that happened on Flight 7 and how SpaceX got to Flight 8 is that, unfortunately, as we all now know, Flight ended up the same way as Flight 7. So let's go through what we saw on Flight 8 and try to figure out what happened. After having scrubbed on Monday, March 3rd, SpaceX again attempted to launch on March 6th for Starship's 8th flight. The countdown went a lot better on the second attempt, with just a short hold for half a minute at the T-minus 40-second point in the count. Booster 15 and Ship 34 lifted off from Starbase and headed east over the Gulf. All 33 engines were working nominally on the booster, all the way uphill, with 30 of them shutting down for hot staging as planned. Hot staging also went well, with all 6 engines on the ship igniting and the booster flipping back for its boost back burn. Despite not igniting 2 engines on the boost back burn, Launch Control decided that everything was still good to proceed with the catch attempt, so Booster 15 aimed back for a return to the launch site rather than a boring splashdown. After flying through the atmosphere, Booster 15 started its landing burn to land back on the chopstick arms at the launch site. Once again, not all 13 engines ignited for this burn, with one of them offline on the middle ring of 10 engines. Super Heavy demonstrated once again its engine out capability and successfully landed on the launch tower arms about 7 minutes after liftoff, becoming only the 3rd booster to do so. After hot staging, Ship 34 continued firing its 6 Raptor engines on a burn that was supposed to last for approximately 6 minutes. This burn would put Ship 34 into a suborbital trajectory that would bring it in for re-entry over the Indian Ocean. Then, at about 8 minutes into flight, we started seeing engines going out quite explosively, and the ship started to lose attitude control. Unlike for Flight 7 though, this time the camera feeds and telemetry held on for longer, so we were able to see all the tumbling and venting from the ship as it lost control. This only lasted for a minute and a half though, and 9 minutes and 30 seconds into flight, the video feed cuts and SpaceX confirmed that they had lost the ship. Just like on Flight 7, the FAA activated the pre-planned debris response area and diverted aircraft or prevented them from taking off in the first place. This caused disruption to several flights, and the agency also ordered ground stops at some major airports in Florida, including Orlando International Airport, in order to keep planes from flying into the area. These disruptions didn't last long though, but still, they did happen. It's also very likely that just like a lot of people found debris from Ship 33 in the area, a bunch of parts from Ship 34 will likely wash ashore in the Caribbean islands. The FAA also confirmed in a statement that it was requiring SpaceX to perform a mishap investigation into the loss of Ship 34, just like on Flight 7. Shortly after the flight, SpaceX updated its website pretty much stating what we all saw. Booster did fine, even though it did have some engines out during boost back and landing burns, and was caught as planned. For the ship, well, they say there was an energetic event in the aft portion of Starship that resulted in the loss of several Raptor engines. Other than that, SpaceX didn't venture to say more about what they saw at the time in the data from the flight. At least for Booster 15, things went a lot better since it had returned to the launch site and was caught successfully. With the vehicle on the arms, SpaceX quickly put it back on the launch mount and proceeded to safe the vehicle. The booster was connected to the ground systems through the quick disconnect and fully detanked. Then teams went up and removed the flight termination system charges as they're no longer needed. Booster 15 is now back at Mega Bay 1 after a quick rollback that happened overnight between Friday and Saturday. That building now has 2 flight-proven Super Heavy boosters inside, which probably has SpaceX wondering where they're going to put so many rockets since there are other new boosters in construction like 16 and 17. It's also got me wondering what an expendable Super Heavy booster could loft, given that eventually they're going to need to get rid of them somehow, right? And you might as well fly a rocket and expend it than just scrap it or keep it around at the Sanchez lot. What do you think? Super Heavy? Expendable? I think that'd be pretty cool. So that covers broadly what happened on Flight 8, but there are a ton of interesting details that one can only notice if you look more carefully at the flight. For example, for the booster, one can see that due to the 2 engines not relighting for the boost back burn, that burn was in turn longer than on some previous flights. This is because with the lower thrust of 11 engines instead of 13, Super Heavy needs a bit more runtime to reverse back all the way to the launch site. The landing burn was also slightly longer than on the previous flight, just 3 seconds longer, probably also because of the engine that did not ignite. But it's even more curious the way Booster 15 came into the tower compared to Booster 12 and 14. When Boosters 12 and 14 came down for their catches, they were facing straight to the tower with their quick disconnect ports. But for Booster 15, at the start of the landing burn, its trajectory was slightly skewed to one side and not in the correct orientation. But then, as it went down to 3 engines, Booster 15 steered itself to the side into the tower and then rolled to face the quick disconnect ports towards the tower. It's not clear whether this was planned or not, but this approach to the tower prevented the engine exhaust from hitting the tower corner and the launch mount during landing. On the day of Flight 8's launch, there were some high winds from the north, so perhaps Booster 15 was trying to compensate for that as it came down, and the exhaust not hitting the mount was just a happy coincidence. Here's where I get to flex a little bit and say that this difference in approaches to the tower can be seen a whole lot better when placing a camera directly across from the tower. I captured footage from this angle on Flights 7 and 8, and we can see that while Booster 14 came from the left-hand side of the screen, Booster 15 came from the right, avoiding the launch mount and tower corner completely. Something interesting also happened right after landing, and that is that the chopstick arms rotated to the left as soon as the booster shut down its engines. We're also not sure if this was on purpose or not, but it definitely prevented the booster from raining debris off its engine section down onto the OLM. Of course, where the detailed look is a lot more needed is on the ship's flight. Since the return of the booster is always the star of the show, we only have views of the ship at the beginning of its flight and then later on closer to when the failure happens. Early on, everything seems just business as usual, with all 6 engines ignited, the ship accelerating, and just everything going as planned. SpaceX kept rotating between a few different views from the engine section to a camera on the flap. On the engine section view, we can see some of the purple exhaust from the center engines and even a sort of mock diamond formed there as well, which could be from their exhausts interacting with the ones from the Raptor vacuum engines. Everything is just normal. Nothing is happening that's particularly unusual. However, if we fast forward to 7 minutes and 45 seconds into flight, we get that same engine shot, but this time it looks different. We can see there's an orange glow on the camera feed. It even acts like a filter and allows us to see the individual exhausts from the center engines and the RVAC engine to the right out of the view. We can also see gas coming out from the bottom of the frame and what appears to be a hotspot on the RVAC on the left. From that engine camera view, the feed then switches to the flap camera view and we can see the ship starts to pitch down prior to the violent venting that happens around the time a bunch of engines are lost. It almost seems like there could be a connection between those potential fires that we can see in the engine bay and the subsequent loss of engines. Much later in the stream, SpaceX goes to a view of the inside of the Launch Control Center room at the Ad Astra site. We can see that the engineers are looking at their consoles and talking to each other, reviewing the data. You know, the normal thing to do when an anomaly happens. But if we take a closer look, We can see two of them are looking at what appears to be multiple feeds that have been saved from the ship's onboard cameras before the signal was lost. The two of them point at one of the feeds in particular, which is then selected and put as a full screen view. That feed appears to be showing the exact same engine bay view that we saw during the stream, but right at the moment the engines were lost. It's clear that some sort of explosion happened at that moment, and it would explain the violent venting seen at that point in flight. Now here is when we have to go into speculation territory, because at least until the time of this recording, no official information has been given on even some preliminary cause for the failure of Ship 34. But given what we do see and what we can observe on the ship's cameras, it all looks quite a lot like Flight 7 all over again. Visible fires taking out engines, and the ship just losing control afterward. That's pretty much what we know took place on Ship 33 on Flight 7. Are we in a similar situation then? It's true that just because there was the same outcome doesn't necessarily mean that it had the same cause. There could have been other reasons for the fires to appear and for the engines to go out in such a violent way, but it's too much of a coincidence that the failure happened almost at the exact same point in the flight. In the case of Ship 33, the engines went out a bit less dramatically and over a longer time span, but Ship 34 already showed potential signs of thrust degradation even before the engines went out. We can see that at T plus 8 minutes and 4 seconds, right before Ship 34 starts losing engines. Its speed is still comparable to Ship 33's speed at that point in the flight, despite Ship 33 having already lost 3 engines, while Ship 34 had all engines still running. A thrust imbalance could also explain the sudden pitch over seen on Ship 34 right before the engines were lost. So now here comes the time we ask everybody's burning question. Did SpaceX really fix what happened on Flight 7, or did they rush it? It's totally a plausible thing, though, that this happened, and it doesn't really need to be the company's fault. Starship is a really complex machine, and sometimes when you think you fix something, it can still come back on the next flight to bite you in the butt. Also, sometimes you fix something, but then it causes an issue elsewhere in a cascading sort of way. An example of this is the ice blockage that doomed Booster 9 on Flight 2. SpaceX went to Flight 3 with Booster 10 thinking that they had solved the issue, but then found out it was still a problem and that the engine inlets were still being clogged by ice. It wasn't until Flight 4 with Booster 11 that they were able to mitigate this ice blockage problem, and now we're at 3 caught boosters on the launch pad. Now, it's also true that SpaceX spent months in between those flights working on getting better boosters and better ships to fly on these full-stack flights. Meanwhile, for the time between Flights 7 and 8, SpaceX only dedicated 7 weeks to even look at this and solve it. There's an argument to be made that perhaps this flight was too rushed after such a complex failure mode on Flight 7, and they might just not have looked deep enough into it. Perhaps they missed something from Flight 7 that was just not properly addressed, and then caused a similar outcome on Flight 8. Honestly, it did feel from the outside as if the preparations for Flight 8 were somewhat rushed. The first dates that we knew for Flight 8 came in the form of road closures and other sets of notices that were indicating a launch on February 26th. Then, SpaceX officially set the target launch date for February 28th, which was then moved to March 3rd. While Booster 15 went to the pad in time for even that initial February 26th attempt, Ship 34 didn't leave for the pad until really the last minute, and stacking happened less than 24 hours prior to the March 3rd launch attempt. SpaceX also did not conduct any sort of full stack test prior to launch, something that had never happened in prior flights. Some flights, like 5 and 6, had skipped a full wet dress rehearsal, but at least they did go through some sort of full stack tanking test prior to launch. Then, when SpaceX tried to launch on March 3rd, a bunch of issues started to pop up during propellant load, with controllers having to work on separate issues on both booster and ship. The ship was then destacked, and teams set up scaffolding inside its engine section and also went into the vehicle's liquid oxygen tank, right where the transfer tubes are located. It was clear that something was up with Ship 34, and there was some last-minute work that had to be done. Also, ahead of Flight 8, SpaceX decided to fly the mission without wrapping up the mishap investigation on Flight 7. On the other hand, though, this is not the first time this has happened, and the FAA has approved this kind of stuff in the past. SpaceX did the same thing ahead of Flight 4 last year, launching that mission before wrapping up the Flight 3 mishap investigation. This has also happened with Falcon 9 last year, with multiple mishap investigations being open while the rocket was still flying. But there might be something more profound than perhaps rushing to the pad or not completing mishap investigations. Just think about it. The situation from Flight 7 can't be replicated on Earth. And I'm not talking about the vacuum conditions of space, but rather things like firing the engines the whole entire 6-minute burn ascent portion of the ship, or firing the ship while it's close to empty tanks. Doing any of this would necessitate a huge change in ground infrastructure, or maybe modifications to the test stand and ship that then could result in not mimicking the exact harmonic responses seen on Flight 7 and 8. In such a case, they would only be able to test the fixes to the transfer tubes during an actual flight, and it would be totally understandable to try and rush to get a flight up and gather data from it. And it would also explain why you might not want to close a mishap investigation just yet, since there's clearly not enough data to conclusively wrap up such an investigation. Alright, we have context, we have a recap, and we have analysis. So what's going to happen now? Well, Elon, ever the optimist that he is already saying on X that this setback is a minor one, and that SpaceX will be launching Starship again in 4 to 6 weeks. As usual, this is to be taken with a boulder-sized grain of salt since, Elon time. Even with no failure on Flight 8, 4 to 6 weeks until the next launch would have been a bit of a stretch. Ship 35 has not performed cryogenic proof testing, and once that's complete, it still needs to get its engines and undergo engine testing. And now, to all of that work, we also have to bake in the work that's necessary to fix whatever happened on Flight 8. And all of this goes back to the previous point of, is ground testing even enough to test a fix if this turns out to be another issue with the transfer tubes? Could it be that SpaceX will have to just completely redesign this fuel feed system and scrap the ships that already have it installed, such as Ship 35? Let us know what you think in the comments. Either way, that would likely shift timelines far to the right, so it wouldn't be surprising if SpaceX tries to work in some temporary fixes and hope that they're good enough, just like they did for Flight 8, and then implement a whole redesign on future ships. But once again, this is complete speculation territory. We'll just have to wait and see how it plays out. The best way to know which way things will go in the future is to stay tuned to Starbase Live and everything that's happening at Starbase, and you can bet we'll be doing just that. Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring this video. Use code NSF to receive 20% off all hover pens for the next 48 hours, and after that, it'll be 10% off. It also includes free international shipping for most countries, including North America, Europe, UK, Australia, and more. Links all in the description down below. That's going to be it for this week. It was certainly one of those episodes that one never wants to have to do, but, well, this stuff happens in rocketry. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget, be excellent to each other.